In 2005, a neuroscientist named James Fallon was studying brain scans of convicted serial killers. He was looking for patterns, differences between a killer's brain and a normal person's brain. He found them. Then, completely by accident, he scanned his own brain. It matched. James Fallon, a happily married professor, a father, a man with no criminal record, had the brain of a serial killer. And that discovery changed everything scientists thought they knew about what makes someone capable of murder. Because the answer was never about being a monster. It was always about biology, childhood, and a series of switches, some of which can never be turned back off. For decades, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit studied the psychology of violent offenders. Neuroscientists scanned hundreds of criminal brains. Forensic psychologists spent careers interviewing the worst people alive. What they found doesn't excuse anything, but it explains everything. Here are the 5 things science discovered about what actually happens inside a killer's brain. Deep inside your brain sits a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. It processes emotion, fear, anxiety, empathy, guilt. When you see someone in pain, your amygdala fires. You feel something. That feeling is what stops most people from hurting others. In study after study, serial killers show significantly reduced activity in the amygdala. The structure is there. It just doesn't fire the way it should. Criminologist Adrian Raine compared brain scans of 41 murderers to 41 non-murderers. The killers showed an 18% reduction in prefrontal cortex activity, the part responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning. And the alarm that tells you something is wrong barely rings. The FBI conducted one of the most extensive studies of serial killers ever completed. They interviewed 36 convicted murderers, including Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Charles Manson. Nearly all of them shared one thing: severe childhood trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, witnessing violence. Here's the science behind why that matters. During childhood, the brain is in active development. Trauma doesn't just leave emotional scars. It physically alters neural architecture. Prolonged stress floods the developing brain with cortisol. This literally damages the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, the regions responsible for memory, emotional regulation, and moral decision-making. A child who is repeatedly abused doesn't just become sad or angry. Their brain physically reorganizes itself to survive in a threatening world. This doesn't mean every abused child becomes a killer. Most don't, but it sets up the conditions. And then genetics loads the gun. In the 1990s, scientists discovered a gene variant called MAOAL, sometimes called the warrior gene. It affects how the brain processes serotonin and dopamine, the chemicals that regulate mood, aggression, and impulse control. People with this gene show higher rates of aggression and impulsive behavior. It was significantly overrepresented in violent offenders. But having the gene doesn't make you violent. Research shows MAOA only correlates with violent behavior when combined with childhood abuse. The gene alone does almost nothing. The trauma alone does limited damage. Together, they create something far more dangerous. This is what scientists call the diathesis stress model. Nature setting the kindling, nurture lighting the match. Which brings us back to James Fallon. He had the brain structure of a killer and the warrior gene, but he also had a stable, loving childhood. And he never hurt anyone. His story is the most powerful evidence we have that biology is not destiny. One of the most consistent findings across serial killer psychology isn't about violence. It's about fantasy. An obsessive internal fantasy world that develops years, sometimes decades, before the first crime. FBI researchers found that almost every serial killer described a rich, detailed fantasy life that began in childhood or adolescence. Violent scenarios they replayed mentally, refined, escalated over time, not random dark thoughts. Structured, elaborate, and deeply pleasurable mental rehearsals. The neurological explanation involves dopamine, the brain's reward chemical. When the brain rehearses a pleasurable scenario, it releases small amounts of dopamine. Each repetition reinforces the neural pathway. Over time, the fantasy becomes compulsive. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, kept detailed journals of his fantasies for years before his first murder. Ted Bundy spoke in his final interview about how violent fantasy escalated progressively until acting on it felt inevitable. This is why serial killers rarely act spontaneously. By the time the first crime occurs, the brain has rehearsed it hundreds of times. This is the question that makes neuroscientists deeply uncomfortable. If we can identify brain patterns, genetic markers, and childhood risk factors, can we predict who will become violent before they do? The short answer is, partially yes. Researchers at the University of New Mexico scanned the brains of 96 inmates before their release. Those with lower activity in a region called the anterior cingulate cortex were twice as likely to be rearrested within 4 years. In 2020, a machine learning model trained on childhood risk factors was able to predict violent reoffending with 70% accuracy. But here's the ethical wall. You cannot imprison someone for what their brain looks like. You cannot label a child dangerous because of their genetics. The science can identify risk. It cannot assign guilt. What it can do, what researchers are actually pushing for, is early intervention. Identifying at-risk children not to punish them, but to get them therapy, stability, and support before the neural pathways that lead to violence become permanent. Because the most important thing science has taught us about killers is this. In almost every case, there was a window. A point where the right intervention could have changed everything. We just didn't know where to look. James Fallon spent years after his discovery trying to understand himself. He interviewed his own family, dug into his ancestry. He found a long line of violent relatives going back centuries. He had every biological ingredient for disaster. But he also had a mother who loved him fiercely, a stable home, and a life that never gave the darker parts of his brain a reason to activate. The science of serial killers isn't really about monsters. It's about how close any human brain is to darkness, and how much the world around us determines whether we ever get there. That's not a comfortable thought, but it might be the most important one. If this video made you think differently about the human mind, subscribe. Every week we go deeper into the science behind the darkest parts of human behavior. Like the video if you want more. And tell me in the comments, did the James Fallon story change how you think about nature versus nurture?